about it. A little bit of quick background on us, both Peters and Controle. I think you're going to find that both of us are pretty tightly aligned with Microsoft. We're both members of what's called the high touch community, which is there's about 200 high touch partners in the world. So we've got a pretty significant footprint in that space. We've been around for quite a while. We're highly credentialed, respected. Peters and Associates has been around for 37 years. We're kind of like the slow and steady. And Kevin, I think you'd say your Controle's a little more up and coming, and less than 10 years old at least. But we share a common mission, I think, and that's to help you guys with GDPR, and we've got some history of helping our customers in these spaces. So. I think one other slight difference you're going to see, in different approaches and viewpoints, if you will, is, and for those that may have attended, Peters and Associates webinars before, you certainly have seen our security wheel. Our wheel is obviously focused around data, and certainly from our perspective, we're pretty good at all the controls that go around data, whether it be, we've got a history of doing firewalls, right, and infrastructure, endpoints, identity, managed services, and things of that nature. And Controle's definitely much more focused on the data aspect of things. They've been in areas of, they've had a history, I think, of defensible deletions and focusing very much on data classification and where data resides and what you should do with it, how long to keep it, and things of that nature. So they come at it from a little different approach, but I think the synergy here for you is that GDPR requires both, and therefore we're going to bring hopefully both of our experiences to light. So let's start with some GDPR basics. Everyone might come from a different platform in terms of what they might know about GDPR, and certainly it's a multifaceted and complex regulation, if you will. That said, I think our goal, especially today, is not to dive too far into the weeds on any particular area outside, especially areas outside of our comfort area, right? There are definitely some legal components that Kevin nor myself is necessarily qualified to tackle. You may have some legal representation that might be needed as part of this, and some governance goals. But our goal is to kind of keep the story simple, but just know that there are many tentacles, if you will, to this beast. So specifically what happened is back in the EU, or European Union, the residents, kind of like ourselves here in the US, probably got fed up with the data losses that were happening at the hands of organizations, right? It's a pretty common thing that we open up our paper or read our e-paper or whatever it may be, and we'll see news of yet another breach where our identity might have been compromised, or either our credit card numbers or other information about us has been leaked. Personal identity loss is certainly something I think that we deal with on a daily basis. Well, a while back, the European Union decided to do something about it, and as one of the second largest governing body, if you will, they passed legislation siding with the EU residents and saying, hey, we intend to have some legislation that's comprehensive and definitive about the protection of your data. And to even make, so comprehensive and definitive are two terms that we'll kind of redo throughout this presentation. And then to kind of make sure that it was serious, they also kind of made it punitive and timely. So you'll see some stats over there in terms of what you're forced to do and what some of the major tentacles are. But effectively, this is about a privacy law, and it's to protect EU citizens. Okay. So with that, we kind of introduce the nomenclature of Simon or even Natalia, right? These are some names that maybe you might expect to be in the EU, and I just kind of put them out there. And effectively, there's many rules about personal information here in the United States, right? Illinois has different PII rules than Indiana, than Wisconsin. Generally, as states, we share a common set, but some states go a little further. Illinois and actually Florida have some very comprehensive PII rules. That said, all of the US rules about PII, this is really, the EU GDPR rule is really PII on steroids. Okay, pretty much any data that can be tied back to Simon or Natalia, including things such as an email address, IP addresses, cookies, really anything that ties back to them beyond even the scope of PII is in scope. Okay, and is protected. So obviously some of these items will be further probably defined in courts in months and years to come, but I think the spirit of the GDPR is that the intent is comprehensive. And that's that term that I had used before. It is a very comprehensive set of data. And at a minimum, obviously, we can focus on those things that we know about today, but expect this to morph a little bit over coming weeks and months. Okay, so if we keep Simon and Natalia and we kind of go in here, let's move into intent about being definitive. So we knew that it's comprehensive, but in what way is it definitive? Well, it's definitive because Simon and Natalia are data subjects. And as data subjects, they're subject to a bunch of rules that we're going to see here shortly. But in simple terms, the party that collects the data is called the controller. Okay, so if you collect data regarding EU citizens, maybe you collect health records for EU citizens because you're in the healthcare business, or you're a marketing firm and you happen to outreach. Any of the data that you collect, you're in a controller position, and you have directly collected that information regarding an EU citizen. Similarly, if you have some data that maybe you didn't collect, but you are actually you actually do work on, maybe it's a database that you, as an email list, as an example, maybe another firm, you send email databases and you hand that off to a firm that sends emails on your behalf. That would then put them in the processor position. So data subject are the people in there, controller is the person collecting the information, processor is the person working on the information. People can be one or the other. But in simple terms, I think that's kind of defines that. And then on the right-hand side, you're seeing a kind of a brief list, I'll call it, of what I'll call a Bill of Rights. Kind of lays out some very specific rights and capabilities that Simon or Natalia, or our proverbial European Union customers, can do with their data. Okay, and so let's look at a couple of those. The right to access their information. That means they need to know within your systems where their information is. They have the right to actually get rid of it, or the right to erasure. The right to data portability, meaning they can say, I would like my data off your systems as I'm going to one of your competitors, or I'd like it just erased. So data portability, erasure, access, the right to be informed. So if there's a breach within your data, they have to be notified. So all of these rights kind of manifest themselves, and they're, again, comprehensive and definitive, I think, are the two words that I'd used so far. Hopefully this is making sense so far. I guess we're trying to keep it simple and just note the fact that it's focused on privacy. Kevin, anything you want to add at this point to that?
Yeah, no, I think you've hit it all, Bruce.
Yep. We're next going to move into the 4 tenets upon which you can do something about it. Okay, and this is what the law states. So again, if you're subject to, first is determining if you have some of this data on your systems. And next is trying to walk through what we call 4 stages: discover, manage. Maybe I'll use the key here to kind of point them out a little bit as I'm discover up here, manage, protect, and report. Okay, so those are kind of, think of it as like 4 phases of a project. Might be one way to kind of think of it if you're kind of in the project delivery space. But additionally, think of it as 4 ways that they designed protection mechanisms around this. So certainly our intent is to walk through all of these. But in the discover area, that's mostly about what data do you have, right? There's obviously a number of legal elements up there also regarding consent, or what they call minimalization to collect, meaning you should collect the least amount of information possible. There's information about retention, right? Another kind of legal item. How long are you going to keep some of these things? There's your privacy policy. There's contracts, right? So a number of technical, or a number of legal elements, but also some technical elements with the first question: what data do you have, right? And so, one of the things that we kind of highlighted there and stressed is a technical data assessment. And, Kevin's going to kind of walk us through what those technical data assessments look like, just so we kind of get some understanding. But That's really the discover phase. And again, just kind of high level each of these 4 areas, then we're going to deep dive into each one and get actionable. So under 2, manage. Okay. Obviously, there are some articles that we reference in terms of the legality as to where it points to what areas to do here. But under manage, you're going to get very familiar with a term called Data Protection Officer, or DPO. Okay, that's a term people are throwing around nowadays. And what are the qualifications to be a DPO? Who would best serve in that role for your organization? Well, it would help as I overview it. That person's job is going to be to oversee, part of the classification. They're going to be oversee the governance, if you will, of that data. They're going to act as a point person for execution of yet another term you're going to see here, something called a data service or data subject request. And Kevin's going to spend a fair amount of time talking about data subject requests. Again, another industry term, and really one of the, I'll call it the fear areas with regards to how the rubber's going to hit the road here, is data subject requests and data subject request delivery. A third area is down here is protect. Okay, and again, some more articles, but the goal here is to protect personal data from loss, damage, or breach. Well, great. We do this all the time, right? We already have a security plan. Well, the security plan now has some teeth and some regulations behind it, and this will be my job to kind of walk you through this. But basically, the job is to keep data adequately confidential. Okay. In order to do that, I think one of the first things you're going to consider is a technical controls assessment. What do I have in place? What do I not have in place? Or what do I not have adequately in place? And help you build a information security program that maybe has a roadmap to it to fill in the gaps over some period of time. I think the technical controls assessment is a key to that. And the fourth area that we'll kind of walk through is report. Okay, and report is twofold in my opinion. First of all, it's to kind of do the detection and response on systems. So if you have over here, you have some systems that were inadequately protected or not protected. When there's a breach, it's your job to detect that breach, and that could be as simple as an antivirus console popping up that Josie's workstation has antivirus or has a virus issue with her, some malware, and that malware could have manifested itself in some data that might have been on her workstation. If you knew the location from up here in the discover phase, that Josie's workstation had stuff on it, and in fact Natalia or Simon's information was on there, and that because of the malware outbreak, you may have had a breach of data. So the detection of that and your response will all be part of it, and it's kind of a technical nature to kind of have consoles or logs that are alerting you as to some of the problems. Sometimes people bring all that information into a centralized alerting system called a SIM. But in addition to the detection and response from a technical perspective, there's also a need to do activity recording, okay, and reporting, meaning how did you execute on that data? Oh, so you sent that email list that I had referred to earlier that as you as controller may have given to a marketing company to send an email to these constituents. Did you record when you sent that over to them? Did you record what emails were sent to? Were there any non-delivery reports? Things of that nature. You're going to be expected to contain some activity reporting around your activities with regards to that data. Not just technical activities, but also activities in general. So that's kind of a quick walkthrough of the 4 areas. Again, we're going to spend a little bit more time in each. And at this time, I think I'm going to hand this over to you, Kevin. It's going to kind of just refresh your memory. We're going to cover discover and manage, and Kevin's going to talk specifically through how one of their products can kind of help in some of these regards to deliver in the discover and manage phases of things.
Perfect. Well, thanks everyone. Bruce, if you can just go back one slide.
Yep.
I think that one thing I want to kind of point out is, and Bruce already talked a little bit about this, but GDPR in general is incredibly complex, and one of the things that makes it even more complex for organizations to deal with is you got two sides of the equation here. You've got kind of the legal and compliance side, and then you have the straight up technology side. So as Bruce had talked about, what we're not going to get into today is really kind of the legality side of things. It's really more on the technical side of things, but even in the technical area, in accessing and protecting and managing all this data, it's incredibly complex. So as we talk about these kind of discover, manage, protect, report, as we go through these, just know that these are really geared on the technical side. So what we've basically, considering at this point is you've engaged with a law firm to understand, what are your unique requirements? Do you have to deal with the GDPR? Do you not have to deal with it? Pretty much the general rule is if you have any kind of data of anyone in the EU, whether it be an employee or a customer or processing the data, then you do have to deal with it. So even though I know probably most of the folks here are U.S. based and maybe even locally Chicago based, doesn't mean that you don't have to adhere to the GDPR. It's really just no matter where you are, if you're dealing with EU citizens' data, then you have to deal with it. So what I'm going to dive into now, so Bruce, you can go ahead and proceed, is what I thought would be helpful is we have had, I don't even know how many conversations with different folks around different customers around GDPR and what they're doing, and it's really a very broad spectrum on A, people's even understanding of GDPR, and then B, what are they actually doing about it? So, for those of you who may or may not know, it is actually in effect now. So the GDPR just came into effect late May, and we're already seeing some things come out of it. There's already been a couple fines, a couple class action lawsuits. So what I thought would be helpful is just to kind of talk about, through hundreds of customers that we're dealing with around this right now, what has been the typical process that people have done to kind of tackle this, because once again, it's incredibly complex. There's a lot of moving parts to it. So what I thought I would do before we get into the technical side is just share some of what we've seen and with the customers that are ahead of the curve or actually meeting the obligations right now. And then a lot of customers, if you listen to Gartner, about 75% of the customers still are not ready, and some of you folks might be in that ballpark. So if you're not ready, hopefully this will give you some idea what other folks are doing. But typically what we've seen, and this really kind of started about 18 months ago, 2 years ago, when people started getting serious about it once everything was released, is folks would typically do a GDPR 101. Like, what is this thing? Why do I have to deal with this? Do I have to deal with this? Just generally what it is. We have a kind of like a running joke of, GDPR, what is this GDPR thing? For some of you folks, that might even be today. We just did a presentation a couple weeks ago and had probably 20, 30 customers, and probably half the group had never really heard about it, and we're just told, hey, go figure it out. So hopefully you're not in that situation, but if you are, we can give you some practical tips what folks are doing. But usually what folks are doing is they'll understand, okay, we believe we have to deal with this, and doing some sort of a assessment where this might be, working with a law firm or a company like Ernst & Young or someone like that, larger consulting firm, and understanding how you're, managing data. Are you controlling it? Are you processing it? And then once you get into that of, okay, we have to deal with it, really, since it's the heart of it, it's all about electronic data and managing it effectively and securing it. It's going about and doing a data discovery effort of, okay, where is the PII? Do we have it? Where is it actually housed? Is it in Office 365? Do we have information in file shares? Do we have information in SharePoint? Do we have information in structured applications like SAP? Do we have cloud applications that have PII like Salesforce or whatever it might be? But getting kind of an understanding of where the data is, because A, you have to protect it, and B, you're going to have to produce it. So a lot of folks are still kind of going through this area right now, just trying to, understand where all the information is, because how are you going to protect it if you don't know where it is? So we'll talk about this in a minute. Then it gets more into kind of planning it out. Okay, doing some technology workshops, and this is something that Controle and Peters can help you out with if you're not at this point of, okay, what technologies do we have in place that can help us meet the requirements? Of course, everyone's always trying to leverage what they currently own. Good news for those Office 365 customers on the phone. Microsoft's put a lot of investment and focus and energy around this. You can leverage a lot of the native Office 365 components for that. We'll talk about that here shortly. Do we need to augment it with other technology to really help us out with this? And it's something worth considering because the fines are so hefty. Bruce talked a little bit, but we're talking about 4% of revenue fines. There was a company that had a massive breach last week. They're looking at a $400 million fine. So pretty serious numbers. People are concerned about it, even potentially taking them out of business. But once you get past the kind of technology workshops, it's okay, let's start planning this out. How are we going to actually do this? Putting together the team. Typically with companies that we're working with right now, there's a team. There's folks from security, there's folks from IT infrastructure, there's folks from compliance, there's folks from legal. You could have external companies as part of your team. We're doing quite a number of work with customers in this area now. And then really coming up with your policies and procedures of not only your updated privacy policy, so part of the GDPR requirements that a lot of folks are focused on or have been focused on in the preceding months to May 25th was you had to have a published privacy policy. So how are we going to store Bruce's data? What are we going to do with that? And that was a very clear thing companies had to do right off the get-go. So if your company is has to deal with the GDPR and you have not done your updated privacy policy, get on it because that's one of the clear areas that folks can identify if there has been a breach of the GDPR. It's also why we have all probably seen 100 emails in the last couple of weeks saying we've updated our privacy policy. That was all around GDPR. So I know there's a lot of jokes going on around about that, but it is pretty serious. And just procedures around, okay, what are we going to do if we have a data subject request? So what if Bruce goes about and asks us to produce all this information? He has that right, and customers are receiving those requests now. And then once you get into kind of, okay, we have the policies put together, now we want to get into kind of transition of let's get the technology going. So we kind of know what technologies we have in place. We might need to configure some things. We might have to do some work. We might have to augment the technology. We have the kind of legal compliance put together. Now let's start going and figuring out what's our classification strategy. Data classification is a requirement of the GDPR. How are we going to, configure these technologies to meet the requirements? How are we going to look at, what's going to be our response protocol for data subject access requests, planning all that out. Some customers, not necessarily, have decided as part of these efforts, they want to clean up data. They want to migrate data to the cloud because there's better enablement technologies around security and producing. So there's a lot of work here. Bruce and I will talk about some of the kind of technical requirements here, and then really gets into training the end users. Part of the requirement is making sure end users are aware of what this is and how to use data, and then really kind of adoption it. And a lot of folks right now are going through the phase of kind of internally auditing themselves, making sure they're ready to go. And not that every customer goes through this process in this order, but certainly these things all need to be touched upon at least some high-level points. So I'll stop there. Is there any questions, comments here?
And again, you're welcome to take yourself off mute. Just by default, I think the Skype client's got you on mute. So just hit the button on the microphone, and we'd hear you, and certainly can make it interactive if you prefer. Just type things in the IM window, and we'll grab them. We do have like a little Q&A break in the middle too. If it's just because we want this to be. We want to answer some questions you might specifically have in these areas since you've got the expertise on the phone. Kevin, the only thing I'd say is that nobody cares about Bruce's data, right? It's only Natalia's and Simon's data because Bruce is a U.S. resident, and who cares about Bruce's data, right? Facebook can use it all they want.
you're the other Bruce Ward in London.
Yes.
Natalie, see your slide. Yeah, we'll be able to provide the slides, no problem. So Bruce, we'll go ahead and go through. So once again, before we jump into the technology and what folks are doing, what I thought would be helpful is just giving you some kind of best practices that we've seen. Once again, we've seen some nightmare scenarios. We've seen some customers doing a really good job, and everything in between. So the best practices in general for the folks who are actually ready and doing this is one of the biggest things is making sure legal, compliance, and IT are on the same page. whenever we've been brought into kind of some tough situations where, IT will bring us in saying these legal people they don't have no clue what they're doing, and we need help here, and it's usually because there's just not a lot of communication going on. It is GDPR touches both sides of the equation, and it's similar to e-discovery in the States. You kind of have to be on the same page. Otherwise, you're going to make your life a lot harder. And if you need help kind of bridging that communication gap, there's folks like Controle that can help jump in. If you're late to planning and you're just getting started, and some customers certainly are in that boat, I would suggest focusing on the highest risk areas. And there's very clear what the highest risk areas right now are. There's 3. So there's a lot of requirements, GDPR. We're not going to go through all of them. The number one concern everyone has had, and really this has nothing to do with IT, so that's good news, is privacy policies. So it is a straight up requirement that you have to have an updated privacy policy. It has to be published on your website or distributed. And May 26th comes and you did not have an updated privacy policy. If you were caught, that would be a breach. And a significant one. So there's kind of 2 different categories of these fines. One is up to 2% of revenue, and then the other one is up to 4% revenue. Privacy policies is I believe it's in the 2% bucket. So very concerning. A lot of people did address this already, and it's more of a legal concern. Once again, that's why you're receiving all those emails saying we've updated our privacy policy. The second is these data subject requests. So Bruce talked about it. Simon and Natalia have the right to say, show me all of my stuff, essentially. So customers are getting these now. I'm going to take you through an example of a workflow through one of these, but essentially they have the right to say, I want to see all of my information. I want to make sure that the information is correct, and I want you to delete it if anything is wrong or if I just feel like it. So that is their right. You have 30 calendar days to produce that. If you don't do it in that time frame, that's a breach. So this is a very, it's basically like e-discovery for those folks who've been on the phone. You have to go out, you have to find the data, and you have to be able to produce it. So I'll walk you through that. That's a real risk area for folks right now. The third one being breach prevention, detection, and notification. So you have to know if you've been breached. You have 72 hours to report it and detect on it. So I know Bruce is this is where really Peters comes into play and kind of great solutions in this area. So they'll talk you through that. And finally, with data classification, a lot of some customers are trying to do it right off the get-go. Some are waiting for phase 2. With data classification specifically, less is more initially. Don't try to boil the ocean and tackle it all at once. It's probably not going to work. If you've never incorporated a data classification strategy, typically we're just suggesting you just look at specific use cases. Find the PII, label it as something simple like confidential, sensitive, and automate as much of it as you can, because if you're dependent on your end users to do it, they will either not do it or they might do it incorrectly, and no fault to them. They're busy. They don't want to deal with it. So as much as you can automate on the data classification side, that is highly recommended. Any questions here? Okay. So that's a little bit about just kind of general best practices that we're seeing customers doing once again on the technology side. And then we'll talk a little bit right now about the 2 risk areas on the technical side. So data subject requests, I'm going to go through this in detail here shortly. But it's really, once again, you have the obligation. Someone makes a request saying, show my information. You have to find it, produce it, and either delete or change it. It's incredibly difficult to do because data is all over the place. Once again, it goes back to we talked about identifying the sources that you have PII in, Office 365, an email, Salesforce, SAP, whatever it might be that has some information about an individual. You need to understand where that is, and you need to go in those systems and you need to get it out and produce it. So that's very challenging to do. 30 days to do it. You need to track how you're doing it and what you're doing and be able to prove that you did it correctly. So if you get audited to prove what you did, or even worse, you have a class action lawsuit by the requester for not producing it in time, If you do not have a defensible and kind of repeatable process, you'll be putting yourself in a lot of area of risk. And then finally, breach prevention notification. So these are the two technical risk areas that folks are concerned about and are really addressing. So that is what we're going to dive into now.
Yeah, and that'll be my area. But everyone tries to prevent. Everyone tries to put enough controls in place that things don't happen. But I will tell you, as an IT organization that is responsible for a number of systems and are the people that get called, I guess, when people have breaches. Breaches happen, right? And as much as you try to prevent, you, the CIA, and organizations with many more dollars committed to IT controls than you have breaches occur, and when they occur, we need to be able to detect it and notify. So, with that ado, I think actually, Kevin, I had one question on the DSR versus DSAR. Is there a distinction up there? I'm not familiar with the DSAR term.
Yeah, so you'll hear people use different terms to explain these data subject requests. So the terminology in the GDPR is data subject access rights. So that's the actual term around their right to access their data, essentially.
Gotcha. Okay.
People, the actual then requests that come in are referred to as data subject requests or data subject access requests. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't, it's just people are using different acronyms we have found to explain the same thing. It's really go find my information and give it back to me because I want to take a look at it.
Perfect. All right.
So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take over Controle here, and what I thought might be a little bit helpful is just diving a little bit more into these data subject access requests and your obligations and the challenges. Then we're going to show you an example of one of what a customer is doing in the workflow, and then we're going to show you some technology that Controle has that can help you and aid you in the process. And how that interacts with the Microsoft technology.
We see the screen.
You can see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So once again, the reason we're focusing on these data subject requests is you might be getting them now. I would say probably less than 2% of the customers are actually in a good position to answer these. It's incredibly complex, and it's very clear a breach if you don't produce in 30 days. So that's why the kind of the diving deep in this area. So here, the next couple slides you're going to see are were put together by Gartner and shared from us. So I thought I would just walk through them. So here are the requirements. So Bruce talked about right of access. So then essentially what it is you're allowing these folks in the EU to access what is theirs. So the GDPR defines that any data that has my name or Natalia's name or Simon's name in it, that's my data. It's not the company's data. Whether you agree with that or not, that's up to your interpretation, but that's the GDPR's stance. So you have 30 days to go and find it all and produce it back to them. So the challenge with that from your perspective is, the questions you're going to ask yourself is, oh man, how do we find this data? Does anyone know where this is? Okay, we probably know it's in this HR file folder or this HR system like Workday or whatever it might be, but is it sitting in email? Is there something that was shared in email? Is there something sitting in the file shares, which is, do we have any technology to find it? How do we do it? How do we do it fast? How are we going to compile all this data from all these silos? Because I guarantee there's not a single customer that has all your PII in one system. It's all spread out in these various silos. So how do you go and grab it from that system, this system, this system, this system, grab it all, put it together, and produce it back? And so there's a lot of challenges here. So they have the right to what they call rectification, simply right what's wrong. So, I moved a year ago, moved a house is only about a mile away, but if my information is wrong and I want it to be updated, because if there is a breach, I don't want someone knowing that for whatever reason, I have the right to say, show me all my information. If any of it is wrong, I want you to fix it, because if there is a breach, someone's going to have my information. So the challenge for you is, okay, how are they going to request this? So first you have to give them the data, then they're going to look at it, And then how are they going to request it? Is that going to be an email? Who's doing what? How is this going to be tracked? So how are you, if in case of a class action lawsuit or an audit, how are you going to prove who did what? Right to be forgotten. So this is the one that gets a lot of press. This is basically deleting data. They have the right to say, get rid of it, find my information and delete it. This is a very complex topic. I'm not going to get into all the details here, but because there's legal obligations. You can have a legal obligation to keep it on legal hold. There's all sorts of legal arguments that get made here and are being made here. But this is a requirement. How are they going to request it once again? How are you going to track this? How are you going to centrally manage this? What tools do you have in place to actually delete the data? There's a lot of questions in this one. And the scary thing here is not only is there potential for breach, but they have the right to bring class action lawsuits. Right now, it's a little bit crazy, but there's a group out of Belarus right now that's going to companies and saying, if you don't, give us $500,000, we are going to send you 5,000 data subject requests tomorrow. So, and then they had the right to bring class action. You might have seen the day after the GDPR came out, there was a $5 billion class action lawsuit put against Google and Facebook. So real challenging here. So what's your organizational challenge here? How do we do this all correct so we don't have to deal with this? Here's Gartner's recommendations. How are you going to answer these requests? Prepare to answer them, mock it up. And we suggest the same thing. Data classification, label it by purpose, and control the deletion after retention. When you're thinking about deleting the data for the right to be forgotten, don't forget backups and data processors that might be also working with the data. So a lot of this is going to impact how companies are choosing businesses they want to deal with. So finally, I'll show you this slide. This is an example of a data subject request. This particular instance, this is a customer of ours. We are part of their team. It's one of our services is to actually help you perform these. We do this for about 100 customers on the e-discovery side where we help them go through this process. But really, there's a lot of steps here. This is more complicated than you'll think. But how are you going to set up the system where you receive the requests? Generating tickets. Do you have a ticketing system? Do you have to identify the person? Are they really who they say they are? Going through, finding the data, going to the different systems, pulling the data out, collecting back to them, reviewing it internally. There's just a lot of work here. So I'll stop there, see if there's any questions. Otherwise, what I was going to do here is give you, just because in the essence of the time, I'm going to be very, very brief demonstration of how this would work, unless there's any other questions. Okay, so just in the essence of time, I know Bruce has still got some time to go through. One of the biggest areas which we've seen of challenge is, actually I'm going to go back here for just 1 second, is how, we talked about discovering the data. How do we go and find this information, especially on the legacy data that's sitting in our file shares? Within Office 365, there's some native capabilities. We can certainly educate you how to find Office 365, but a big challenge is how do we find it against existing file shares? A lot of information, PII, is typically in there. We've developed a technology called eGovern, where essentially what you're looking at here is kind of a quick demonstration, kind of a before and after scenario. You have a document that has not been classified. It has some PII in it. You don't know that it's out there. So a lot of what customers are trying to do is pull up these documents and look at them manually. That's very error-prone in classification. Essentially, we can create classifications within Azure Information Protection, which you're seeing here, and a lot of folks are doing this as part of a GDPR effort. Once you kind of get this through, you can start going out and searching through the existing data and looking for key attributes and automatically tagging it and then using that information to automatically produce it. So you're seeing an example here. This is our tool. We basically point it at unstructured data sources, which is typically the data sources challenging to get at, and then we can work with the data and massage the data. So we go out, we index it, we then identify all the content in the environment that has PII. We have a number of pre-built GDPR ones. Show me all the credit card numbers, show me all Simon's information, gather all this information up, and then we can automatically classify the data based on rules that you set up, and then finally go ahead and produce the data back to the custodian. So the idea here is, how do we go and find PII amongst all this mess of data, compile it all, give it to the end users, and be audited and tracked. So certainly able to do a follow-up session on this. I know we're running a little short on time. I want to make sure Bruce gets to his area. But this is an idea of our particular technology. There's other technologies to help you get an understanding of the data so you can meet your obligations to protect it and produce it for these data subject requests.
Perfect, Kevin. Actually, that was a good time to ask questions too, if people have them. And there's a few generating in the IM window, so I won't take a stab at them, but maybe you and Nate can do so, and we'll keep moving here. I'm going for the percent.
So I see Bernard's question. I'm not a lawyer, so I will preface it with that. But yes, if you are collecting information, even email addresses, which I know seems crazy, and those folks are in the EU, that would constitute you collecting PII. You would be controller of PII, and you would have to deal with the GDPR. So once again, lawyer. So, but that is the interpretation of the law.
You play one on TV?
Yeah.
Isn't that a line from something?
We do have attorneys on staff at Controle, by the way, that can give you an informed opinion there. But
yes, someone does.
And right. I see Charles' question on DPOs. Bruce, why don't you go ahead and go through, and I will respond on that in line.
Okay, sounds good. So we're on the GDPR Protect, and just kind of as a reminder, kind of back to our grid, we've discovered, we've done some discovery and some management, and under the Protect, our goals here were to, keep the data adequately confidential, right? And we talked about maybe doing a technical controls assessment, figuring out what we're doing today that's proper, and what we might need to do, maybe as part of a roadmap to have a more complete information security plan. So I point to first, I guess what I'll call something called the compliance area from Microsoft, or compliance manager from Microsoft. I point to this only because I think, as Kevin had mentioned, with Office 365, there's some nice little bells and whistles, I'll call it, that are included and thrown in for you. And one of these, and I think it helps for any person, is to understand the compliance and kind of what they're expecting. And so if you have Office 365, you have something called Compliance Manager. It's at the Service Trust URL. So just type in Service Trust Office 365 and you'd find it, or the URL was back on the PowerPoint that will be shared. But long story short is you can put whatever compliance standards you'd like in here. Obviously, the one that we're talking about today is Office 365 GDPR. And just for a quick overview, you can see that in general, there's over 100 controls that need to be in place. Okay, 65 plus 49. That said, 49 of them are already done for you because Microsoft's got it, right? You don't need to worry about physical security of your Exchange server, which has possibly some Natalia and Simon's data on it, because the Exchange server's up in the cloud. Microsoft's handling the physical security of that. So that would be one of the Microsoft managed actions. But you are still responsible for the customer managed actions. And so just to kind of give you a quick preview of what's in here, they break each rule out into obviously Microsoft managed versus customer managed, and they give you a dashboard for you to go take a look at the assessment and kind of manage that assessment process either on your own or with the help of a consulting partner. So as I drill in here to security and I kind of go down, I'm going to use a different window, not hiding anything. I just want to find the right one. Here's an example of what this dashboard looks like. So the control itself is has some control ID to it, but the control title is do an independent review of your information security. Oh, that's great. We as a company hire ABC company to come in and take a look at our security every year, and we do vulnerability scans, quarterly. Okay. Great, you've got evidence that you do this already. And so from a evidence perspective, you may want to upload maybe the most recent evidence to this. This, again, your portal. This is for you to manage. So you could upload some documents. You could assign this to someone on your team. Choose who on the team you might want to assign it to. You could have a status for it. So essentially, this is a dashboard for just managing the process of becoming compliant. But I just point out, these are some of the things that you're looking to do. Independent review of information.
Hey, Bruce, not sure if I lost you.
Yeah, you lost my audio there for a moment. Sorry about that. I moved too fast and my USB became unplugged. I got all excited about this security stuff. And so there's other rules in here, but some others I just kind of point out. Information security awareness, education and training, management of removable media, right? Some of them are just, they kind of hit home, but it's evidence of things that maybe you're doing or maybe you're not doing. And again, this portal is just by one way to manage it. Doesn't mean you have to do it that way, but let's go back to the slide deck and let me show you some other areas. Other areas you would have seen in there were things like user identities, right, and multi-factor authentication and so forth. So there's the URL if you're interested in looking at all the 100-plus compliance areas that you need to work with. I guess what I'd point out is that from a helpful perspective, we have the capability, and we are helping dozens or nearly 100 customers with security awareness efforts today. After all, security is about people, process, and technology, and we obviously focus sometimes too much on the technology part of things, leaving our employees to still click on phishing emails or ransomware emails that kind of get us back into, evade a lot of our security and technical controls. So we have a process for educating people on security awareness. We can also combine that with quarterly or annual lunch and learns and some policy reinforcement around GDPR and meaningful data and things of that nature. So just wanted to kind of make sure that you were aware of that. Also for things like simple things like backup. Obviously, every organization has backup, right? And it's just a system everyone has. But what I think would be deemed unreasonable relative to the GDPR standards is if you had failed jobs that you weren't reacting to, or if you had untested restores, or if you were missing servers or data volumes, or if data was traveling, Joe takes a tape home or a disk home every week, right? That's our offsite storage, right? If that's unencrypted data volume and he lost it, then you've lost some data, right? And that data might contain Simon and Natalia's data, right? And therefore, that would be very unreasonable and subject you to fine. Untrained personnel, things of that nature. So know that there are solutions and organizations out there that can help you. And basically, organizations like ourselves, we own the backup processes for 100-plus organizations. This is what we do, right? So things like that, firewall management. You're likely going to have to manage 1, 2, or 5 firewalls in your environment, depending on the number of sites. We currently manage over 80 firewalls. We do testing and vulnerability scans. We have all the log events aggregated to things. We correlate those events with other things that might be occurring in your environment. So all of these things are possibilities. And just kind of summarize capabilities from things you want to think about. All of your servers, right, and workstations require patching, and they require patching at a reasonable level, right? What is reasonable? Well, what is your patch management strategy, and are you executing on it strongly? Is your antivirus either out of date or not installed on any systems? Are users not trained? So we've got a shared responsibility for over 4,000 systems, and we have complete responsibility, meaning we own it in terms of patching, backup, antivirus, and security for over 900 systems. So we've got the experience, I think, to kind of help you along in this regard to kind of getting yourself security. From a specific perspective, an area of focus that our customers have asked us to be concerned about, and therefore we've developed some good process around. We've got 2 things that are going to be of meaningful for 365 people. We've got a one-time Office 365 security check, where we're actually looking at 44 different things. And I'll give you some examples. Two of those or three examples are for audit logging, audit logging meaning what activities is Joe or Simon or Natalia or anyone that's on an employee on your system, what are they doing? That's turned off by default. There's no cost to turning it on, but it's off by default. Well, most organizations that we've talked to have said, why don't we turn that on? Exactly. Why don't we turn it on? Because then you have that activity reporting that, again, was part of Phase 4 of GDPR. Additionally, something called modern authentication is turned off. Why is that turned off by default? It's actually not on new tenants, but presumably you spun up your Office 365 tenant longer than 6 months ago when they made it default. So now it's probably a good idea to go back and turn it on so you could take advantage of multi-factor authentication and some other bells and whistles. Similarly, things like on your email inbox, POP and IMAP, which are a couple technical terms for a technology that was used, 10 years ago, if you will, to talk to mailboxes. That's turned on, right? Making you subject to, more exposure than you probably need to be. So that one-time security check, kind of going through things, is a $2,500 exercise to go through, evaluate all those settings, and help you remediate them. Similarly, because some of these things change over time, we've got this weekly Office 365 security check where we're looking at a smaller subset, some of the ones that you're seeing on the screen. Email forwarding. Is anyone forwarding email out to Gmail? Is anyone forwarding email out to other locations? And did that get set up in the last week? So we're looking at these things on a regular weekly basis. Did anyone get added new into our admin capabilities in 365? Were any new mailboxes created without auditing capability on? Because every time you create a new mailbox, you have to turn on auditing. So is it part of your process today? Were there any logins from foreign countries that were not expected? We've seen about 40% of our customers that have Office 365 have what I call active mailbox compromises occurring at this time. Meaning someone is in your inbox, listening to your emails, and able to respond on your behalf. Okay, we've seen that with about 12 security checks we've done recently. We saw it at 4 or 5 customers. So anyway, those are some things to talk about. There's a whole host of other things that, 1 through 15 here. The good fortune is we're having a webinar tomorrow on Office 365 security. So if you happen to be in the Office 365 space or might have some interest in that, we're going to cover that, Windows 10 and Enterprise Mobility Suite, and kind of walk through and actually demonstrate some of the features and capabilities thereof. So good fortune for that. So on the reporting front, which was the last element of this, remember the goal was to kind of make sure systems were logging, right? And that was turned on, and that was kind of a feature that I think you'll want to look at. Hey, where are my firewall logs and my antivirus and my backup and my wireless controller and my server logs going to? And so in order to ensure that you're detecting things that are occurring on these systems, it may be helpful to walk through and turn on logging. This is something that I won't walk through here in the interest of time, but certainly something we're going to be taking a poke at tomorrow into the Office 365 webinar. And other than turning it on, you may also want to aggregate it. And so there's a number of systems out there that you have, antivirus backup, your patching, your disaster recovery systems, maybe Active Directory. All of these systems have logs associated with them. If you want the logs to go back to a centralized location called a Security Incident and Event Management, we actually run that as a service for dozens of customers. We have 24/7 detection of all those events, and we'll do, for high priority events, we'll actually do 24/7, 365 responses to that. So again, meeting the letter of the GDPR intention under the response for your technical area. I think e-notify, Kevin, you were going to kind of mention that you also have some notification capabilities in this space.
Yeah, just very briefly, we have a technology that will help you manage these data subject requests. So it's really around your obligation to report on, who made the request, who's doing what activities. It actually integrates with Office 365 as well. So if you wanted to then go and automatically create a search in Office 365 for any of Simon or Natalia's information, it will do that as well. So it's really a tool to help you manage these requests and meet your obligations as far as reporting and what you're doing.